Good afternoon and welcome to the Rural Research Symposium Exploring Sustainability, Housing and Environmental Risks session. All lines are in listen-only mode. This session is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand after we have concluded. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and your question will be answered by a speaker or subject matter expert. You will also find links to the speakers' bios and the presentation deck there as well. Lastly, if you have any technical issues, please use the Q&A box and someone will assist you. With that, I will turn it over to Freddie Mac Climate Risk Director Ryan Vaughn. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My name is Ryan, and I have the honor of hosting today's session. The presenters we'll hear from are Wesley Miller. Wesley is a senior research associate at the Texas Real Estate Research Center at Texas A&M. He's an economics Ph.D. student at Texas A&M, and his research focuses on public and urban economics. Wesley's paper is called Estimating the Effects of Natural Disasters, Evidence from Hurricane Harvey. Second, we'll hear from Cara Clase. Cara is a Ph.D. candidate studying urban affairs and public policy at the University of Delaware. Cara holds a BA in mathematics and an MA in economics that she utilizes in her quantitative studies of energy insecurity and intersecting hardships. Cara is focused on housing and sustainability-based solutions to urban energy insecurity. She also has an interest in how policy solutions can differ based on the needs of different energy landscapes. In her spare time, Cara helps with grant writing and community outreach initiatives at her local animal shelter and occasionally assists with strategic partnerships building a Senegalese health philanthropy called the Foundation for a Healthier Senegal, FOSHIN. Cara is an alumni of Yale University's Environmental Fellowship Program and will be part of the 2022 cohort of APPAM's Equity and Inclusion Fellows. Cara will be presenting a paper called The Fork in the Road, the Diverging Policy Pathways to Rural and Urban Energy Security in the U.S. Lastly, we'll hear from my colleague here at Freddie Mac, Ajita Atreya. Ajita is a senior economist with the Economic and Housing Research Team of Freddie Mac. As a senior economist, Ajita is responsible for research, analysis, and forecasts of the macroeconomy with a special focus on housing and mortgage markets. In 2020, Ajita was named the 2020 Rising Star by Housing Wire, an online periodical. Before joining Freddie Mac in 2016, Ajita worked as a research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton Risk Center, where she conducted research on various economic and risk-related issues of natural hazards. Ajita has published several research articles in leading peer-reviewed journals. Her work has also been featured in several popular media outlets. She is a member of the American Real Estate and Urban Economics Association and the National Association of Business Economists. Ajita holds an MS from Oklahoma State University and a PhD from the University of Georgia. She's going to be presenting a paper today called Sea Level Rise and the Impact on Home Prices, Rural versus Non-Rural Counties in Coastal Florida. With that, I will pass the mic to Wesley.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm going to be presenting my work, Estimating the Effects of Natural Disasters, Evidence from Hurricane Harvey. This is an ongoing project of mine, so I appreciate any feedback that the audience may have. So jumping right in, my primary research question is how does flood damage impact residential mobility decisions? So taking a step back from flood damage, what do we know about natural disasters more generally? Well, we know that these are increasing in frequency, and as well as that they're very costly events, with the federal government spending more than $100 billion just since 2017. This is in terms of recovery measures after disasters, as well as mitigation to try to prevent and get out ahead of some of these costs. So we know that more disasters are affecting more people, which makes it imperative that we know how these individuals and households are affected. So we know these are destructive events in terms of physical, financial, mental health, but digging into the details, we learn a lot from the Hurricane Katrina literature. And one of the main takeaways from this literature is that conditional on surviving that storm, there were actually improved outcomes in terms of health and children's test scores and labor market outcomes on average for this population that was impacted by the storm. And so it's important, one of the primary mechanisms through which these average benefits were observed was this population was displaced from kind of a stagnant New Orleans economy at the time, and people moved to Houston, Atlanta, or other parts of the country where maybe they had a better education system or healthcare system, and so they were able to take advantage of this new environment. And so it's important to, as we're looking at these other natural disasters that are being experienced across the country, it's important to be able to see if we can extrapolate some of these results into those contexts, or if this was just an idiosyncrasy associated with Hurricane Katrina. So to take a look at this, I'm going to be examining Hurricane Harvey, which landed in Texas in August 2017, and at some peak levels poured up to 60 inches of rain, flooding over 200,000 homes and resulting, obviously, in extreme damage. And so I'm going to be narrowing in on this western portion of Houston outside the city center. And you can see these two green spaces here. This is the Addicks and Barker reservoirs. Now, these are federally owned land that for most of the year serve as beautiful green space. They're baseball fields and soccer fields and natural foliage. But their primary design is that during major rainfall events, water will actually fall and run into these earthen dams on the eastern edge of these and hold water kind of like a giant detention pond to protect the city center and allow for controlled release of water during these major storm events. And these were constructed in the 1930s by the federal government, but in the 1980s, in the 1990s, the city of Houston was growing outward and started to demand some of these amenities that this green space offered, and developed these subdivisions outside on the outer edge behind here. So what I want to do is, like, the thought experiment that I want you to think of is that during Hurricane Harvey, this water flowed into the reservoirs and started to pool back upwards. And for the first time in history, they actually surpassed where the federal government had estimated would be the maximum water level. And so development had occurred outside of that level. And now during Hurricane Harvey, water reaches into the neighborhoods. I'm going to be comparing outcomes in residential mobility for homes just on one side of where that peak water stopped, and to homes that were unfortunately on the wrong side of that peak water level. So this gives you an image of these neighborhoods in the Barker Reservoir. This is the Cinco Ranch master plan community, and you can see that the flooding, reached throughout many of these neighborhoods. In this top right corner, you see a concentration of green space here, and that's the edge of the reservoir, that green space that I mentioned. So how am I going to do this? Well, mathematically, I'm going to be looking at the relationship of residential mobility as a function of flood damage. And so I'm controlling for neighborhood fixed effects. This is important because I want to be comparing homes that are essentially homogeneous, that are the same. So I'm going to be looking at these comparisons within the same neighborhood. We know that flood damage is correlated with a plethora of factors, including proximity to water. If a home lies close to a bayou or a creek, it might be exposed to more flood risk. Flood damage is also a function of mitigation measures that households can take. Maybe they raise their home up higher or install flood vents. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a property's elevation to isolate, say, exogenous variation in flood damage to try to get at this causal impact that it may have on residential mobility. And so the way I do this is in a regression kink design, which you can kind of see here on this right side. I've standardized a property's elevation because I'm dealing with two reservoirs and two counties. So the peak water level varies in each of those contexts. So RI, a property's elevation, is defined and equals 0 if it lies right at that peak water level. For homes that lie below that level, they'll take their elevation falls in the negative category, and vice versa. If they lie above the peak water level, their standardized elevation will be positive. So getting into the data, I measure a property's elevation using LiDAR data, and I've defined this. We don't actually know what the elevation of the property is. There's variation of elevation on a parcel, and so I'm going to define the actual elevation of the structure as starting at the maximum ground elevation. Okay, so that's an assumption, but anecdotally, that's where development is concentrated for drainage reasons, and so that's the assumption that I've made. I'm measuring flood damage as the change in appraised values, and so importantly here, the 2017 appraisals were conducted before the storm before Hurricane Harvey, and 2018 appraisals were conducted 4 months after the storm. So this measure of flood damage is going to incorporate some recovery measures that were taken in the 4 months after the storm. As you can see from this distribution here, there's a mass at 0, which means many properties received no change in appraised values. And this is rather unexpected. In 2017, the Houston economy was growing and housing prices were appreciating until the storm. So we would have expected a concentration of appraised values on the positive region. You also see this distribution here at about $100,000 in losses in terms of appraised values, which we'll see is concentrated in these from these damaged homes. And in terms of outcomes, how I'm measuring residential mobility, I'm going to do this in 2 ways. First, I'm actually looking at the probability that a household lists their home for sale. So this is kind of the beginning of this process, measuring the intention or the preference to leave or move from that house. And then I'm going to take a next step and see if they actually sell their home. And this listing and sales data is coming from transactions that occur through the Texas multiple listing services. So obviously these don't represent all transactions that occur, but the vast majority of single family sales are conducted through multiple listing services. So a little bit about my sample here. So as I mentioned, I'm dealing with 2 counties, Fort Bend and Harris County, and 2 reservoirs. All of the Fort Bend County homes in this sample are located in the Barker Reservoir. Harris County split between both. And you can see that there's variation in time in terms of the value of these homes, with Fort Bend County being slightly newer, so higher valued homes here, and variation within Harris County as well. The median home was built in 1999. Construction really was slowed, and these kind of subdivisions were built out through the 2000s. We don't see very much activity after 2010, and the median square footage is 2,200 square feet. Okay, so I want to explore this relationship between elevation and flood damage. And I showed this picture earlier, and this is just theoretically what we could see happening is that once you're above that peak water level, the water hasn't reached you, we don't expect there to be any flood damage. But as you get lower and lower below that level, we expect your flood damage to increase. Now, I've drawn this linearly. This relationship can be highly nonlinear. This is just a theoretical example. But the data here actually looks strikingly linear. These are standardized elevations for these different portions of the sample. And what I see is that below this threshold, each inch lower that you go below this threshold is associated with about $2,300 of flood damage. And then once you cross that threshold, this relationship essentially disappears. So I do the same exercise for different characteristics of the property with appraised values, square footage. And the important part here is that around this threshold where we saw such a clear change in slope in flood damage, we don't see any relationship between these characteristics and elevation. And that's important because the assumption here in how I'm identifying my results is that the only difference between homes on this side of the threshold compared to this side is that they were slightly lower elevated, and so they were exposed to flood damage. So I'm running short on time, jumping into the results here. I'm going to be looking at how households were impacted by $100,000 worth of wealth shocks or flood damage. And I showed earlier that distribution of properties that suffered such a magnitude in damages. And so again, first I'm looking at listing propensity, just putting your home on the market, signaling a willingness and a desire and preference to move. And we see that just 4 months after the storm, so this is post-Hurricane Harvey through 2017, we see a 6 percentage point increase in the probability of people listing their homes for sale in the sample. The coefficient is stable as we include covariates like square footage and other property characteristics. There's a slight dip here, but the difference is statistically indistinguishable from one another. And this effect size grows through time, although my standard errors grow as well, and so I start to lose some precision. I'm working on expanding the sample, and I've got some other ways that I'm going to try to improve precision at this level. And then, as expected, the sales behavior and sales propensity follows the listing behavior essentially the same, with the same pattern. Not every listing ends up selling, so we actually have a little bit more noise here, but the pattern is essentially the same. So the major takeaway here, beforehand, we had all this knowledge of these impacts from Hurricane Katrina and these potential positive impacts, and they were based on this premise of mobility and people moving. But that population, can differ from a lot of the contexts and populations that are being exposed to natural disasters today. And so it was kind of an unanswered question of if people actually have disproportionately positive wealth and are tied down to an area through housing, if they were actually going to exhibit such mobility. And what I find is we do. So, we're seeing this in a different population. Some of those results may be extrapolating to different contexts, and this effect persists for multiple years. And so kind of my next step, what I'm doing in this project, is to see how does this mobility translate and transmit into these other factors of individuals' lives, just like we saw in Hurricane Katrina. So I'm going to be looking at where these households move to, the quality of neighborhood and access to amenities, as well as physical, financial health, labor market outcomes, et cetera. So this is a work in progress. I hope that you guys check back in my research in a couple months, and I look forward to any questions and feedback you may have. So thank you very much, and I pass this off to Cara Clase.
Thank you, Wesley. As he stated, my name is Cara Clase. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Delaware at the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration. And my presentation is titled "The Fork in the Road, the Diverging Policy Pathways to Rural versus Urban Energy Security in the U.S." So to start us off, just going to cover some basic definitions and sort of how energy insecurity is conceptualized in the literature. Energy insecurity can broadly be defined as when a household is unable to afford or access a sufficient amount of energy to meet their basic needs. So in earlier literature in the 1970s, you'll often see this coined as fuel poverty. You'll see this pop up in UK studies, mostly focusing on cold climates. And their main focus was the affordability and the efficiency of energy. So they're looking at factors such as heating systems, prices, housing insulation, etc. Then later in the literature, in about the early 2000s, we see it evolutionize into energy poverty, which not only looks at affordability and efficiency, but also accessibility and safety. So in these types of studies, you see more research pop up on developing countries and more of a focus on the types of energy that's received, and topics like indoor pollution will pop up, where maybe households, in particular in developing countries, may burn things such as biomass inside the household, which can cause respiratory damage and other health risks. And they also focus on stable energy infrastructure that's reliable and that can hold up in mild to inclement weather. And then lastly, in the literature, we then see energy insecurity pop up about in the mid-2010s. Diana Hernandez from Columbia University is often cited for this term. And it's sort of a buildup. So it focuses on affordability, efficiency, accessibility, safety. And it also has an interest in the behavioral patterns and the social impact on energy insecurity on energy poor households. So in studies like Hernandez, not only do they look at the figures and in terms of energy costs and what have you, but also they take a look at the narratives of these energy insecure households and how it impacts their social life. So for example, grandpa might live in a house where he might not be able to afford to keep it properly heated, and therefore he might not be able to have his grandkids over, and he may experience different types of social exclusion as a result. They look at hot climates, cold climates, developing and developed countries in these types of studies. So next, I'm just going to highlight the importance of sustainability. Just real quick, the UN definition of sustainability It's just being able to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to also meet their needs. And even though sustainability might not be the sole key to energy security, it's going to be an important piece to the puzzle. In particular, in the United States, the use of fossil fuels is going to somewhat pose an obstacle to general energy security for these marginalized and low-income households because, one, fossil fuels has a high price volatility. So from geopolitical events, the price can be very sensitive. It can be low one day, high the next. Just think of the oil embargo of the 1970s or kind of our current situation with gas prices. Of course, fossil fuels also contribute towards GHG emissions, 65% in the US to be precise. So think of the problems like indoor pollution when you're burning certain types of fossil fuels or biomass inside the household, which knocks into my third bullet, can be unsafe forms of energy. So just to kind of drive the main point home here, according to a study conducted by the International Energy Agency in 2019, it was a cost-benefit analysis. Fossil fuels would only be the most efficient path to energy access for 25% of any energy-poor households internationally. So as you can see from this stat, we're going to have to explore sustainable solutions if we want long-term solutions. So here I created a policy timeline. I'm not going to go through each individual policy, but I wanted to highlight some of the major ones in the United States. So here, established in 1976, we have the Weatherization Assistance Program, or WAP. This program is focused on helping qualifying households to weatherize their house or to make it more energy efficient. So think improving the insulation of walls, sealing cracks in windows, doors, updating outdated heating systems, perhaps, etc. And they will do this for free. Then you also have, established in 1981, Low-Income Home Energy Assistance, or LIHEAP. This is a program that is more of a direct financial assistance to qualifying low-income households to help them with their energy and utility bills. And then here is the low-income housing tax credit, which might not seem apparent in its relevance to energy security just off first impressions. But what this does is it gives tax credits to certain property owners, LLCs, or construction companies that may build or refurbish older buildings to create housing. And they will receive this tax credit if, in return, they promise to allocate a certain percent of their units to low-income tenants and keep rent below a certain maximum. So every state has a qualified allocation plan where to give out these LIHTC credits, these constructors have to meet a certain green energy or energy efficiency standard. So this can kind of be seen as an indirect way of getting newer, more energy efficient housing for low-income people that is somewhat affordable. And then at the end here, I have a couple of rural policies I wanted to highlight. So there's the Rural Energy for America program, established in 2008. It provides loans and grants funding to rural small businesses and agricultural producers, aka farmers, to make renewable systems and energy efficiency improvements. And then we have Rural Energy Savings Program, established in the 2014 Farm Bill. It provides 0% loans to rural utilities and cooperatives for energy efficiency financing programs and or electrification and renewable energy projects. So quickly here, I'll skim this just to sort of give more context as to what I'm referring to as rural and urban. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, an urban area is just a densely settled, broad labor market of 50,000 or more. In my research, I use a higher cutoff just because if we use the USDA cutoff, there's some areas that might qualify as urban that socially we might not recognize as urban. So when I plotted the metropolitan statistical area populations in a population distribution, I found there was a natural break at about 250,000, which is the median. So that's what I use as the cutoff. And as a result, when I'm, looking at urban areas that meet that qualification, now I'm looking at areas that we might more readily think of as urban, like New York City, Chicago, or LA. And then for rural, this would, according to the USDA, would just be any area below 50,000. But if you look at the Health Resources and Services Administration's definition, it's a little more refined. They do define it as rural urban commuting area codes 4 through 10. These codes just sort of define these areas based off of their population density, the distance for commuting between key like marketplaces and destinations and what have you. And also these areas have to have 400 plus square miles with 35 people per square mile or less. So quickly here, I have a graph, a table where we're looking at rural versus urban energy insecurity and sort of like the different targets and factors here. So in rural areas, we have a higher percentage of homeowners, 81% to be precise, while in urban, we have a little under 60%. So that's going to be something important to note as we look at the asymmetric interests problem. In rural areas suffering from high rates of energy insecurity, they have the distributors versus residents problem. So there's not much generally economic incentive for distributors to make sure they get energy out to rural areas just because there's less clientele there, less profits to be made. But nonetheless, these people still need the energy. So, one policy issue to tackle is how do we incentivize these distributors to provide energy services in rural areas. And then in urban areas, we have the landlords versus tenants issue. So through programs like WAP, the Weatherization Assistance Program, a lot of these urban areas, a lot of people are renters. And so with this WAP program, they do have, certain caveats where if they do weatherize the household, landlords can't just raise the rent all of a sudden. So landlords sort of don't really find an incentive to engage with WAP, even though it might help a tenant be able to make their energy or utility bills. So it's an issue of how do we incentivize landlords to engage in these energy efficiency programs that will benefit their tenants. In terms of infrastructure, we kind of have two different scenarios here. So in rural areas, there's issues with electrification and, market failures, one of which I described distributors versus residents, but also just making sure the infrastructure isn't outdated, it's sturdy, and it's going to produce stable, reliable electricity. And then in urban areas, we do have older housing infrastructure, especially in areas where marginalized groups might have a history of being redlined. There's going to be housing quality disparities as a result. And so these populations who tend to be older or female or people of color tend to deal with these households that have poor insulation systems, older energy systems, et cetera, that make the achievement of energy insecurity harder. And so in terms of the policy motive to tackle rural versus urban energy insecurity, with rural, there's a higher need. So in rural areas, there's higher poverty rates. They have limited transportation options. So like the cost of fuels and, stuff like that. There's no way around commuting, basically 99 times out of 100 in rural areas. And they tend to have more infrastructural issues due to that distributors versus residents asymmetric interest problem. And then in urban areas, the policy motive would be you can achieve a bigger policy impact if you target an urban area just because it's a denser population. But overall, the common thread is, these low-income households, whether it be urban or rural, are vulnerable to high energy burdens. Low-income households in urban areas are 2 times higher than the average household, and in the rural, it is 3 times. And so for my last slide, just to wrap up, we're going to have a little bit of diverging policy paths here. So we do want to keep energy efficiency and sustainability at the center, but for urban, it might behoove us more or behoove policymakers more to pay special attention to renter-targeted policies. In rural, you might want to target more homeowner-targeted policies, so maybe WAP might be more beneficial in the rural area, maybe an urban policy like LIHEAP or utilizing the low-income housing tax credit program. With urban, you're going to want to tackle that landlord-tenant asymmetry problem. Perhaps, like I said, direct utility assistance or maybe a revision of sort of the utility billing system so that we can incentivize landlords to care about their tenants being able to pay their energy and utility bills. And then on the opposite side with rural, perhaps it might behoove policymakers to focus on renewable energy projects. Rural spaces tend to be prime spaces for things such as solar and wind. And perhaps we can have, as you can see on the bottom here with the green double-sided arrow, a reciprocal relationship where maybe we can create these renewable energy supply markets in rural areas that can supply cleaner energy, perhaps to nearby towns and cities and urban areas where their consumers can be. This would incentivize distributors to build energy infrastructure and connecting energy infrastructure to rural areas while also creating a market that urban residents can benefit off of. And that is the end of my presentation. I will now pass it on to my fellow presenter, Ajita.
Thank you, Cara. Hello, everyone. My name is Ajita Atreya. Happy to be here today to present at the 2022 Rural Research Symposium alongside this fantastic panelist that we just heard from. Very interesting research, I must say. For my talk today, I'm going to talk about the impact of sea level rise risk on home prices, and I'll also set some light into the rural areas of our study area and how that's different from the urban area. And the reason this research is important is because in the past few years, there were a few research articles that came out and they presented us with very worrisome results, like the ones that I have highlighted here. For example, they were finding that the Florida is seeing signals of a climate-driven housing crisis, that the sea level rise risk is neglected no more, rising sea levels are taking down housing values, so on and so forth. So we thought, why not investigate and see if there is any price effect of sea level rise risk on home prices in Florida. Now, let me just give you a quick rundown of the research and key findings, and then I'll get into the details. So we have 3 key objectives here. The first objective is to determine if coastal buyers pay less for homes that are exposed to sea level rise risk by pricing in future expectations about the sea level rise risk. The second objective is to examine if different buyer types have different levels of awareness for sea level rise risk and therefore discount the sea level rise risk differently. And the third objective here is to determine if Hurricane Irma in 2017 had any impact on home prices. In terms of study area, we look at 35 coastline counties in Florida. Data come from different sources, including the public records, NOAA, FEMA, Census Bureau, University of Florida, and we use the hedonic regression method for our analysis. Let's go through these key findings quickly, and then we'll jump into the details. So what we find is that homes exposed to the risk of rising sea levels, they are sold for less. But the price discount, it's limited to homes that's also located in the FEMA 100-year floodplains where flood insurance is required. The second key finding is that both owner-occupied and non-owner-occupied homes are discounted if they are exposed to sea level rise risk. But again, the discount is limited to the ones that are also located in the FEMA-designated 100-year floodplains. The third key finding is that after Hurricane Irma in 2017, homes that were exposed to risk of rising sea levels, both in and out of the FEMA 100-year floodplain, were discounted significantly. Now, let's talk about where the US population reside. And when we look at the US population and where they reside, roughly 40% of the population reside in a coastal county. And when you think of a buyer who is trying to buy in the coastal area, they get information most of the time. I'd say not all the time, but most of the time they get the information about the existing risk of being located in the 100-year floodplain via FEMA flood maps. And their willingness to pay for the risk depend on how they perceive that risk, which vary if they have had direct and indirect experiences. For example, if in areas which is directly hit by flood, the risk perception is pronounced. And so your willingness to pay might be different there. It also varies depending on how the media is highlighting the event if you are not of the area or if you are looking into more dire risk projections for the future. So these different things is going to be affecting the risk perception, which will eventually affect the willingness to pay for that risk. When it's available, the existing risk information is accounted for in the form of a lower real estate valuation, especially in the wake of a hurricane. But in many coastal areas, as you may imagine, the riskiest properties are also the most desirable due to their amenity value. Everyone wants to live near water, which is not a surprise. And on top of this existing risk of being located in the 100-year floodplain, with changing climate, one of the long-run risk facing the coastal housing market is the risk of sea level rise, which may not be an imminent threat for many, and water is not rising as it would in a bathtub for sure. But a forward-looking buyer may perceive that risk as high risk, and they may reduce their willingness to pay. And as Steeler noted in 2014, one of the many risks that housing market face is the speculative behavior from buyers and sellers. So if buyers and sellers start to speculate about the future sea level rise risk, then that will have an impact on housing market. When we look at the literature around the impact of sea level rise risk on home prices, the literature is limited, but it's growing. I'm not going to go through all the literature here because we don't have enough time, but just to give you an overall results of these studies, the results are mixed. They find relationship of a negative impact of sea level rise risk on house prices to no relationship, depending on what kind of buyer you are looking at and the geographic concentration of the research. So the results are mixed. So we thought we'd add to this lean and rapidly growing literature in 3 different ways. First, our study it distinguishes the SLR exposed area, which is the measure of future risk, into area intersecting with FEMA designated flood zones. And this is an important distinction because the price discount that the previous studies have found in the sea level rise exposed area could be due to the requirement that flood insurance is required for being located in the 100-year floodplain. So that flood insurance requirement may be translating into a discount for the home prices. So this distinction becomes very important. And if there is awareness around sea level rise risk, all else equal, we expect reduced willingness to pay for sea level rise exposed homes, even outside of the floodplain where flood insurance is not required. Second, our study teases out the differential in prices for homes exposed to sea level rise risk across different buyer types, which likely will vary because different buyers have different level of sea level rise risk awareness, they have different risk appetite, and also investment horizon. And we expect homes that are bought by investors in sea level rise risk exposed area, even outside the floodplain, to be discounted more, assuming that these investors are more sophisticated in terms of their awareness of the future sea level rise risk. But on the hindsight, investor may not consider this long-term sea level rise risk if these homes are short-term investments for them. Third, our study tests the impact of Hurricane Ike in 2017 on home prices that are exposed to sea level rise risk, and we expect discounts in sea level rise exposed areas to rise after Hurricane Irma in 2017 due to heightened risk perception. Now, in terms of study area, we studied 35 coastline counties in Florida, and we looked at all the sales within quarter mile of the coastline, which is a feasible walking distance, and most SLR exposure is there. And when we look at the census tract within these counties, what we find is that 9 out of 35 Florida counties have census tracts that are more than 50% are perceived as rural. And this is based on perception. This is based on the rural definition is based on perception. And more than 9 out of 35 Florida counties are considered rural in my analysis, given that they have more than 50% of their census tract that are perceived as rural. And for each property that was sold between 2000 and 2020, we determine if the property is in and out of the 100-year floodplain, and also if it's in and out of the 6 feet SLR projected area. And the reason we choose 6 feet SLR projections is because under one of these scenarios, NOAA scenarios, it is expected to happen by 2050, which is again worrisome because we are not far off from 2050. So 6 feet SLR is what we choose for our analysis. And when it comes to Florida, there is no surprise that it has been hit by several disasters over the years. Our focus is going to be on 2017 here with Hurricane. In 2017, when we look at the claims paid during Hurricane Irma in 2017, we find that over $1 billion in claims were paid out in 2017. And if you look at what was paid out in the rural areas versus urban and suburban, given that the rural population density is very low, there is less paid out during Hurricane Ike, but if you compare it against the population density, this is not insignificant. So even in rural areas, there were a lot of money paid out, claims paid out during Hurricane Ike. Now, talking about the data, we started off with 4.2 million homes that were sold in these 35 coastline counties in Florida between 2000 and 2020, and roughly 6 to 7% of the homes sold are within quarter mile of the coast. So our sample size is around 258,000 home sales between 2000 and 2020. 37% of those are inside the 6 feet SLR, and out of those, 87% were coinciding with the 100-year floodplain, and 13% were outside of the 100-year floodplain. Now, this is our specification. This is the hedonic model where price of the property is the function of its structural attribute S, the location attributes L, and in the location attributes its distance to nearest highway, the golf course view, water view, etc. We have a control for distance to the coast, and also other controls include the type of home, type of sales, what kind of buyer they are they out-of-state buyer, etc. But our variable of interest here is the SLR 6 feet dummy, which is equal to 1 if the property fall in the 6 feet SLR projected area, and 0 if it's outside. And we disintegrate that into whether it coincides with 100-year floodplain and if it's outside of the 100-year floodplain in the second specification. Let's quickly go through the summary statistics. The sale price in 2020 dollars was around $846,000, and we control for all these variables that are listed here. Again, in interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but 33% of these homes sold were owner-occupied, 66% were non-owner occupied, of which 56% were individual investors. Now let's go through the results. So what we find is that homes that are projected to be inundated by 6 feet SLR, they sell for less And the price discount, however, is limited to FEMA 100-year floodplain. So if you look at the left panel, this is a regression just using the 6 feet SLR projection. And we find that there is a discount of around 2.8% for homes that are located in 6 feet SLR exposed area. Does that mean people have information and awareness about the sea level rise risk? Maybe not, because when we disintegrate that area into coinciding with 100-year floodplain versus outside, we find that if it coincides with 100-year floodplain, then there is a discount of around 4.3%. But outside of the 100-year floodplain where flood insurance is not required, there is in fact premium of around 3.5%. And when we run the similar regression, just using the rural counties, the 9 rural counties that I showed earlier, we actually find a premium of 3.6% for SLR exposed home in 100-year floodplain. So there was no discount in the rural counties, but the coefficient is weakly significant in the rural counties. The second result is that non-owner occupied homes also sell for less in areas projected to be inundated by 6 feet SLR. But again, the discount is limited to FEMA 100-year floodplain. So if you look at the right panel, inside SLR and inside the FEMA 100-year floodplain, there is a discount of around 4.6%, but outside of the FEMA 100-year floodplain, there is not much difference between the home prices that are in or out of the sea level rise risk areas. Finally, homes in the SLR exposed area outside the floodplain were discounted after Hurricane Irma in 2017. If you look at the left bar charts here, these are for the ones that are in the SLR and inside the FEMA 100-year floodplain. So pre-hurricane, there was a discount of around 3.6%, but post-hurricane, the discount increased to 5.3%. But the properties that were outside of the FEMA 100-year floodplain, there was a premium of around 7% pre-hurricane, but post-hurricane, we saw a discount of around 3.7%. So what does that all mean? So to conclude, we know that SLR sea level rise risk poses long-term challenge for housing market, and it's adding another layer of risk to existing flood risk. But our research shows no evidence of SLR risk affecting current home prices in coastal Florida, and where it's affecting is the area that's also located in the FEMA 100-year floodplain, where discounts are typical because of the flood insurance requirement rather than in consideration of the future sea level rise risk. And these findings, they are consistent with several previous studies which shows that the discount for homes that are located in the 100-year floodplain as a result of flood insurance payment being capitalized into home prices. So from our analysis, what we conclude is that either there is lack of awareness about sea level rise risk, or the sea level rise risk may not be factored into pricing decision because it's a long-term risk. We are talking about 40 to 50 years from now, and buyers are more focused on the short term, are not intending to own the home long enough for sea level rise to have an effect. And the issue, though, is the absence of price adjustment now could mean decreases in home prices later when the sea levels rises, or FEMA flood map reflects sea level rise risk, which have a significant impact on local housing market, like the ones in Florida, which is already a low-lying area and vulnerable to sea level rise risk. So that's all I have for today, and thank you for the opportunity to present this paper, and I hand it back over to Ryan now. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I want to thank everybody for presenting their excellent research. And a takeaway that I have from all three of these papers is that place matters. And the risk that we face in the housing market due to climate risks, there is no one-size-fits-all policy solution to that, because the damage you experience is associated with the region that you are located in and the characteristics of that area. So I'm going to go through and ask some questions. I want to start with Wesley. Bring it back to your research. In your opinion, what lessons can be drawn or what research maybe remains to be done to understand the impact that flood risk might have on mobility in areas where homeowners are more wealth constrained and may not be able to cover the transaction costs of moving?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's one of the next steps that I'm actually taking, at least in my population, of my sample, is looking at how these impacts differ based on, I show that there's variation in home values and therefore also in terms of variation in wealth levels. I'm trying to obtain mortgage data to try to get at that a little bit more. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. There can be differential effects, across a variety of dimensions. There's no given that all these that all these impacts will be received similarly.
Great, thank you. I think the question of mobility is a really interesting one. As an economist, I think we recognize that people can sort according to their preferences. I'm an economist. I don't know if that was in my intro. But we recognize that people can sort according to their preferences for exposure to risk, and that's one great way that we can minimize the social damage from climate hazards. But we have to make sure that that sorting is possible for all populations. To close, is there anything else you think that the housing market can learn about effective policy research?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked a lot about risk. Ajita's presentation was great in analyzing that. So one thing that comes to my mind is, there's a huge emphasis on the 100-year floodplain in terms of being a primary mechanism to communicate risk to consumers. But there's obviously some shortfalls with such a reliance on that. So the city of Houston, much of that relies within the floodplains. This area that I examined actually lies outside of it, but we saw that there actually was exposure to flood risk, just a different type of flood risk. The mechanism of flooding was different. So finding creative ways to communicate that risk. Also, there's a reliance on disclosure of flood risk. So throughout the years, at least in Texas and other states as well, after there's been these major flooding events or disaster events, there's been a movement towards increased disclosure to communicate that across households, intertemporally. But it also matters on when disclosure occurs. If this is occurring, right on the listing, then that's going to affect sorting differently than if the disclosure is, at the end of the deal when contracts are being signed and names are being written on paper. The timing is important in terms of affecting behavior as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done at looking at that timing in terms of disclosure risk.
Great. And I agree. There is a lot of work to be done. I'm glad you all are doing some of it. Switching to Cara. Cara, I really want to thank you for bringing a presentation to us today that shifted the focus away from just flood risk, because it is so important to recognize that climate extends beyond flood and the risk that it poses to individuals in the housing market. Housing is typically characterized as being responsible for 15 to 20% of domestic greenhouse gas emissions, depending on where you check. And the use of electricity for heating and cooling is the bulk of household energy use. Based on your research, what lessons can we draw to help ensure an equitable transition to a lower carbon housing stock for rural populations?
Yes, thank you, Ryan. So that's a good question. So I think one thing that might behoove policymakers is a support for sustainable energy projects, and in the rural context, just really taking advantage of just the prime circumstances and environment that uniquely rural areas give us that would be prime candidates for these projects. But in particular, if we're going to talk about renewable energy projects and the potential of solar or wind farms, we need to think about, policy wise right now, what are some of the barriers to renewable energy project financing that sometimes these programs have that can make it less accessible to some of these people who live in rural areas. So, for example, with a lot of these grant programs to get partial funding for renewable energy projects, some of them, for example, might require actual hard skill grant writing. And so for those who can't afford it, a lot of farmers will hire professional grant writers to write these grants and write out these eloquent narratives or statements so that they can up their chances of receiving this funding. But there's some obvious issues there in that people who can't afford maybe to hire a grant writer and may not have those skills or come from different backgrounds, that might not be as feasible of a route for them. So I think we need to think about where can we put these projects where multiple people will benefit, not just distributors, but also the people who live in these communities, giving these communities a say and a piece of the pie off of the benefits of these projects, and also think about those barriers, like if they want to engage in those projects, so that we can create greener forms of energy that not only benefit rural areas but can also be used to energize nearby towns, urban areas, etc. What are the barriers to that funding we have?
Yep, thank you. It's a big part of the work that we're doing at Freddie Mac to figure this out. And you've noted in your research that you shared with me that energy insecurity is associated with financial and housing stability. If you could create a housing strategy specifically to help ensure sustainability and for vulnerable populations in a changing climate, what would you focus on?
Well, that's there's multiple parts to that question, but number one, in the context of energy security and affordability and equity, it should be noted that the United States does not have a federally recognized definition of energy insecurity or any variation thereof. So, energy poverty, fuel poverty, whatever you would like to label it. Whereas in other countries like the UK, they do. So one step is, investing more in the research and the forming of definitions from a policy standpoint so that these things are recognized, so that, federal or government sponsored research at least has a foundation of understood, commonly, widely agreed upon definitions to work off of. So that's number one. Number two, right now, a lot of our financing, at least, from the government side, is going towards programs like LIHEAP. So that's like direct financial assistance, helping people pay off their energy bills. But I don't believe, even though I think there is a time and a place for those types of programs, and we certainly need those types of programs, especially for emergency assistance and to decrease, shutoffs and what have you. I don't think it gets to the root of the problem. And I think that's where focus on energy efficiency and sustainability comes in and plays an important part. We're going to have to look closer at things related to building standards. So I had brought up the program like the low-income housing tax credit, right, where they have the qualified allocation plans where there are minimum green standards or energy efficiency standards that are going to make the energy bills or the utility bills lower overall. We need certain building standards so that, people are living in housing with proper insulation, with updated energy or heating infrastructure, the outdated thermostats and what have you, the use of like oil heating and whatnot. We can kind of start phasing that out if we just maybe allocate a little bit more attention and financing to things or mechanisms similar to the LIHTC, where we're tackling the problem once we build this housing versus we're working off of, faulty housing and then we're just giving money to supplement their bill.
Great, thank you. I'm going to internalize that in the work that we're doing here at Freddie. Ajita, turn it to you. Based on the work that you presented today and any work that you've done recently, do you feel that your research supports the idea that buyers' perceptions about hazard risk is different in communities where there are existing flood adaptations? And if so, how can that help us inform better housing policy?
Thank you for that question, Ryan. We haven't done research on whether communities that have invested in mitigation fare better in terms of the property valuation, but I would guess that would be the case because obviously that changes the perception of the risk now that you are protected more. But one interesting piece of literature is around price effect differences across neighborhoods that have more climate believers versus more climate deniers, and a negative impact effect is seen among the climate believers. And from the policy perspective, so as the research shows, it clearly shows that there is lack of awareness about sea level rise risk or any risk for that matter. And why is that? It's because there's lack of information that's readily available. So information is key when it comes to making a smart decision, and that's where I think the policymakers can help by finding ways to provide information about these risks, also finding ways to incentivize people to move away from these riskier areas, also incentivizing communities to become more resilient to this risk. There can be ways to provide a price signal that they are buying in risky areas, or the consumers are buying in the risky areas. So we could do a lot to avoid the big impacts of sea level rise risk in the future and other risk of other perils in the future. And in recent times, let me just add this, in recent times, we are seeing more and more firms putting out information about hazard risk, like the one by Redfin that shows that the flood score for the homes that people are going to buy, and they're also adding other perils as well. And when you go to look for a home, that's the kind of information that will be important for consumers to make informed decision when evaluating these risks of climate change.
I love that you brought up the Redfin study because it is pointing to the fact that as the information gets out there, behavior is changing. Have you seen any evidence of changing hazards driving changes in migration patterns in your research?
Also, we actually have been studying migration patterns, and we have seen some evidence of large out-migration from metros that were severely impacted by natural disaster. And one recent example is pronounced out-migration observed in California post-Camp Fire in 2018. But people fail to learn from past experiences as memory fade. We have seen that in the research and in many literature out there, and they tend to put themselves in harm's way again. So in our migration analysis, what we are seeing is, again, increased movement to high-risk areas from low and moderate risk areas, and these risk areas are defined by FEMA, especially since the onset of the pandemic. Because what happened is, during the pandemic, desirable destinations were smaller towns that are farther from cities, that are bigger and maybe not that costly, but that are closer to where natural amenities are abundant. And when you think of natural amenities often are associated with environmental risk, such as flooding risks near rivers and coast, risks of wildfire near forested areas. So moving closer to natural amenities can also mean increased exposure to various natural hazards. Just to give you an example, Bend, if you remember Bend, a popular June town in Oregon that got a lot of attention in the beginning of the pandemic, is highly exposed to the risk of wildfire. It falls in the top 20% in terms of expected annual loss from wildfires, but people are moving there. And communities like Bend are experiencing massive immigration, because of which these recipient communities are now presented with affordability challenges, which is atypical for these smaller towns. And with growing demand for housing, if you look at the house price growth in Bend, home prices grew by over 60% since the pandemic's onset, which is making it more unaffordable for many prospective buyers. So the short answer is yes, we are seeing evidence of people moving to high-risk areas, and it is definitely impacting home prices.
Thank you, everyone. That was great. That was a great discussion. I hope everyone attending enjoyed. That concludes our presentation on climate risk in rural communities, and now I want to pass to Cindy Waldron.